Hi, friends. This is Jeff Kassman, and welcome to Tradition. I'm back with my friend Jim De Piante. Jim, welcome.
Glad to be here, Jeff. Thank you.
So, folks, this series of interviews and discussions is for folks who are new to the traditional Latin Mass, or perhaps you've been attending the traditional Latin Mass for some time, but have questions about traditional Catholic practices. Maybe you wonder why the priest does what he does at Mass, or why it seems like traditional Catholics even have strange beliefs or different kinds of ways of living and approaching things. Well, that's what this series is for, to understand why we care about things like Latin, or why we look back 50, 100, 500 years to know what our ancestors did to practice the faith, to please God, to get to heaven. That's what we're talking about here today. In fact, if you look back over the last 12 episodes, you'll find that we've talked about things like the different kinds of Masses, the different levels of solemnity of Mass, and what they mean to you, the different gestures and postures we use at Mass, what to do and when to do it. We've talked about things like fasting and abstinence, because if you want to be traditional, if you want to do what the saints have done, you might find that it's a little different than what most people do today. We've talked about things like the liturgical year, which is a wonderful topic, a way to live the faith every day with your family, not just on Sunday mornings at Mass. And of course, we've been talking about the season of Paschal Tide, which we've been in the last few weeks. Last week we talked about, or on the previous episode, we talked about the Divine Mercy devotion, and that generated a lot of controversy. Today, we're probably going to have a little bit more controversy on our next topic. We're looking at the Postconciliar canonization process and the consequences and the significance for Catholics. Jim, are you ready?
Ready to go, bud.
All right. So when we consider what was done traditionally, we see that there are apparent problems for Catholics today on two levels as it regards canonization. Number one is the qualitative aspect. That is to say, the heroic virtue of those who are canonized. The second problem is the sheer quantity that we see today in the Church. It's an extraordinary explosion of canonizations compared to kind of the slow, cautious approach of previous centuries. Jim, what do you think?
Well, the canonization process is supposed to do two things for us. First off, it's supposed to ensure the saintliness of those proposed to us as saints, but it is inherently limiting. So the idea of the whole process is to limit canonizations to only those very few who are truly worthy of such recognition. And we have reason to have our doubts about both of those. There's a simple correlation that we can make. The canonization process was changed considerably by Paul VI in 1969. Then it was changed radically by John Paul II in 1983. Coincidentally, any doubts that we might have are only in regard to canonizations made to those changes.
You know, I was just thinking, do we have any idea how many saints have been canonized in the last 60 years? I mean, even ballpark?
I don't, but it will be in our discussion next week. We're going to talk about the Saint Factory.
All right. So sticking with, I know you always want me to stick with the topic, sticking with, and I'm sure our audience is grateful if we can stay on topic. Sticking with the process itself, significant changes to the process would seem to make it suspect itself. It seems reasonable, therefore, to ask ourselves, are there problems that we see due to the changes in the process itself?
I think it's fair to say, yeah, they are. And that raises another question. Does the canonization process ensure an infallible conclusion? Does it now, and did it ever? But beyond the question of the process itself, we will look in the next episode at other things that cast reasonable doubt on the recent canonizations. And that is the matter of collegiality. which we'll discuss at length. And then there is the question of this morphing change, this in what constitutes heroic virtue. So there are three aspects of it: change of the process, collegiality involved in the process, excuse me, and then this question of heroic virtue. We're going to look at canonizations today.
So it's always good to talk about our terms and define them. Canonization is a disciplinary matter. It's not doctrinal.
That's correct.
And so for folks that are listening, you know, as Catholics, sometimes people think that we're just kind of blind, mindless automatons. We follow our pastor, we follow our bishop, we follow our pope, and whatever they tell us to do, we do blindly because that's what it means to be Catholic, as if we've suspended reason by virtue of our baptism. And that's not true. I mean, I grew up here in the deep South. Everybody I knew was an evangelical or Protestant fundamentalist, and those kind of caricatures, they're just objectively false. But one of the modern errors is kind of a perversion of obedience. Maybe I'm getting off track again here, but I think it's important to distinguish between the parts of our faith that are doctrinal, that bind us, that we're not free to dissent from.
Those that are merely disciplinary.
Exactly. And in that respect, it's the same as the universal liturgical law, which prescribes the manner in which we worship God. Is that a fair analogy?
It's a very correct analogy. Things like canonization, liturgical practice, these things are based on law. And in general, laws are not infallible. These laws have to do with conserving the deposit of the faith, so they have to be understood a little bit more rigorously than just the typical thing that finds itself, for example, in canon law. Even so, if the validity of the law is doubtful, the infallibility of anything based on that law becomes doubtful also. Thus, canonizations are infallible only to the extent that the underlying legislation that defines the process is certainly valid law.
Now, as a good son of the church, I would play devil's advocate of sorts, if the church, pun intended, if the church made these laws, if she developed the whole body of laws that governs canonizations, doesn't she have the right then to change them?
Only insofar as the changes are within the scope of her authority. So the church absolutely has the right to change within the scope of her authority the way we worship. But she can't all of a sudden say, well, what we've been doing all this long, we're going to change. And now genuine worship of Almighty God means we all ride around in a motorboat. And that's absurd. But it clearly points out changes must be made in such a way that the thing that changed still achieves its purpose.
So that would seem to leave us with two possibilities. On the one hand, if the laws that establish the canonization process are legitimate, then it seems we would be bound to accept that the canonizations are likely, probably infallible.
Right.
On the other hand, if the laws that establish the canonization process are doubtful, then we may reasonably doubt the infallibility of the consequent canonizations.
And we can't have it both ways. We can't say that the postconciliar process is based on legitimate law and then deny its infallibility.
Right. Has the church ever said, as a matter of faith, that canonizations are infallible?
No, absolutely not. Not solemnly defined. However, it's a long established position, both theologically and ecclesiastically, as a matter of the church's ordinary magisterium, that the process as it had been defined yielded a very probably infallible result. So on the one hand, we have, for example, Thomas Aquinas as a theologian and other theologians saying, yes, probably infallible. And then prominent among the popes who've suggested infallibility would be Benedict XIV. So while it may not be de fide, to deny it would be a problem. noteworthy traditionalists, people who have studied this matter far more than you and I, espouse the second position. Their position is that the new canonization process, along with the new Mass, the new liturgy, and the new code of canon law, are not infallible and thus do not oblige, because we have serious reason to doubt the nature of these things as valid law.
So just to sum up, to clarify, there is no council that's declared that canonizations are infallible.
Right.
There is no ex cathedra
statement. Right.
Declaration. There's no solemn declaration from the chair by a pope that canonizations are infallible.
That's correct.
The majority opinion of theologians, not to be dismissed lightly, would say they probably are.
Right.
But a Catholic in good conscience could doubt that they are. I mean, that's not even it's not even an extreme statement, just to say you're free to doubt that. Okay.
Free to doubt it would be a little bit strongly stated. We're going to talk about the degree of certainty as theologicae certe,
right?
Sententia theologicae certe, and we're going to talk about that in just a moment.
Okay. But it seems like everything that we're talking about today, kind of hypothetically, everything turns on the legitimacy of the process of canonization,
right?
And of course, what we're talking about is this new process, which is rather different from what we've always had. Is that right?
That's fair.
So, all right. So I want to try and stay on track here. Let's talk about the question of the infallibility of the canonizations. And then in the next episode, if you and I survive the next round of wrath from the audience, we'll look at the difficulties introduced by the Postconciliar changes that cast doubt reasonably on the legitimacy of relevant legislation, and thus on the canonization process, and consequently, ultimately, the resulting canonizations. Is that
fair enough?
All right. Get your armor on. So let's begin by making some important distinctions. First, let's start with beatification. And then, if you could, explain what canonization is.
All right. So beatification is an act of the Pope by which he grants permission to render public honor to the beatus, the beatified, in certain parts of the church. So it's local, it's not universal, and it allows for veneration, what is called the cultus, which in proper theological terminology is the worship of dulia. But it does not mandate it, it simply permits it. It's temporary, it's not definitive, it's reformable, and it does not directly assert that the person is in heaven. It says that you can venerate that person as though he is in heaven or she's in heaven.
How is that different from canonization?
So canonization, likewise an act by the Pope, where he, and this is speaking metaphorically, inscribes the beatus, a previously beatified person, in the canon, hence canonization, the list of saints, and requires that public veneration be rendered. It's universal. It mandates that cultus, that worship of dulia, and it's definitive, not reformable, and it directly asserts that the person is in heaven. And it sets up the heroic virtue of that saint as an example to be followed and recognized by the faithful as part of that cultus.
So it sounds to me like the important difference between beatification is that beatification makes the public cultus possible, and canonization makes it obligatory.
That's right. That's right. It's also worth noting that canonists and theologians generally agree that beatification is not infallible because it's a permission and not a precept.
And of course, Catholics have always had a tradition privately of some level of devotion to people who they presume to be saints, because that's how this all gets started, right? Privately.
Right. In fact, there used to not be a canonization process. A cultus would grow up around a person, and they would generally be recognized as a saint and only subsequently formalized in the canon.
So sometimes people privately will say, gosh, this person was a great saint, and I'm gonna pray to them. And that's where the whole groundswell of a miracle happens, and then a bishop takes notice, and then Rome takes notice. So that's a natural part of this process, but it's the informal private part. And it seems that there's an important distinction here to be made. The difference between a saint, that's someone who's in heaven, and a canonized saint.
Exactly, and it's a crucial difference.
A person who had lived an evil life, therefore, that we could all kind of look at. I don't want to make examples, because then the headline about this interview would be Castman and De Piante say so-and-so was a saint. But let's say there was a person who was an objectively evil person.
Could save his soul.
He could save his soul at the hour of his death and be a saint in heaven. But he would not be canonized. No. Because unless there was some extraordinary public conversion and so forth, like we've seen in many saints' lives, especially in apostolic times, there wouldn't be proof, there wouldn't be evidence of that conversion. So that person would not be canonized. And this, I think, kind of brings us back to the point of canonization, which is the cultus.
The cultus, right. The purpose of canonization is to highlight the saint as a unique model for all of us, for the faithful, a model of having lived a life of heroic virtue, extraordinary. And this is the point, extraordinary holiness. Heroic virtue is not a prerequisite to be a saint. The prerequisite to be a saint, the requirement to be a saint, is that you die in the odor of sanctity. And that can have happened moments before you die. The criterion is, for the saint, they must have lived a life of extraordinary holiness.
Yeah, and it's problematic if the church were in the habit of canonizing people that, to the world, did not have that obvious sanctity.
Oh, this is the problem we face.
So if we were to canonize people who didn't just have this exceptional obvious piety, or we canonize too many people and it kind of became an average sort of thing that just was common, both of those would undermine, they would diminish the actual value itself.
It's a kind of inflation. If everybody's canonizable, how is that an example for us? So the point of focusing on the cultus is how they lived their earthly lives. The point of canonization says, admire how they lived their earthly lives. It's about their earthly life, not where they are spending eternal life. Obviously, how they lived their life on earth determines where they end up. But the point is not simply to say they're in heaven. The point is to give us someone to admire on the basis of how they lived their earthly lives. So this is the thing that distinguishes the canonized saint from your run-of-the-mill garden variety saint.
Yeah, it's not just admire, right? I mean, it's emulate.
Emulate, in fact.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. Every Catholic kid is growing up and he's got his patron saints, and every stay-at-home mom has got those saints that she's pleading to every day.
There's a saint for everybody, and by the way, that's the church looks to criteria like that when she canonizes saints.
And every worker out there has got his own patron saint for his state in life and his troubles and so forth. And if he's looking to that patron saint and what he sees is a mediocre life, that we're not offering people kind of that exceptional heroic virtue. It's
to emulate.
Yeah. Okay. So with respect to these canonizations, it seems there are two aspects of the question of infallibility. First, is the Pope's judgment infallible when he canonizes? And then secondly, is it de fide that the judgment is infallible, such that a Catholic is not free to dissent? Dissenting, denying it, would itself be heretical?
Right. In fact, So there are two aspects of it. Is the process itself infallibly defined to give an infallible result? So the process evolved in history in such a way as to provide a very, very high degree of certainty as to the result. But the church has never said infallibly, de fide, as a matter of faith, that the process yields an infallible result. It's not a dogma. And it's very important to understand that the censure of heresy only applies to dogmas. It's not settled science. Preeminent theologians such as Cayetan held that the infallibility of canonizations, by the way, this is an important theologian in the history of the church, and he held that infallibility of canonization is neither necessary nor even possible, and so have others. That notwithstanding, and this is important, on the assumption that the underlying law on which canonizations are based is valid, it is generally held by the majority of theologians throughout history to be certain, theologically certain, formally sententia theologicae certa. So, of theologically certain. And although we are still morally bound to submit to that teaching, that's a long way down the list of theological certainty from de fide, a very long way.
Right, and anybody concerned about papal authority, which we certainly should be in our era, right? We live in the benefit of the shadow of Vatican I, which was so explicit regarding papal authority, what it was for and what it was not, and the limits of papal authority. But also in these troubled times of ours, these are important questions for Catholics to understand. It's important to state that the infallible authority of the Holy Father is rooted in the deposit of faith, protecting what was given to the apostles.
To us by the apostles in Scripture and tradition.
Right. So it's what Christ gave to the apostles, and we know that based on the Scriptures and tradition. And infallibility is a tool of his to protect and guarantee that and to express it with precision and accuracy. Clearly, a judgment about the life of somebody who lives and dies today is not part of the deposit of faith.
Right, clearly.
And ironically, where that takes us is that you have, it's not just trads, there are postconciliar theologians who themselves openly question the infallibility of canonizations.
They go further than we do. And we're here scratching our heads saying, I'm not totally convinced about some of these saints. Maybe there's something wrong. And so then we go look at the whole process and we play at theologian and we play at canonists. These guys, this is their gig. And Bishop Giuseppe Sciacca is the current secretary of the Supreme Tribunal of the Apostolic Signatura. Okay, so this is, he's important. And he did an article not too long ago in La Stampa. He said, and I quote, "It is the canonization process is the definitive and immutable conclusion of a process. It is the final decree issued at the end of a canonical process. To incorporate it in infallibility means extending the concept of infallibility itself way beyond the limits defined by the First Vatican Council." He's not entirely wrong.
Yeah. So, I mean, canonical just is the central part of that. It tells us that it's not.
It's not.
The essence of the law is not infallible. So, when a pope canonizes, just to review the process, when a pope canonizes, he makes several separate judgments. Number one, that the deceased person is in heaven. Number two, the deceased person persevered in heroic virtue. Number three, the heroic virtue is a model to be imitated. Number four, the whole church is obligated to venerate the person publicly. So can we not establish that all or even any of those judgments are infallible? Because it seems to me if the church is holding up a person and saying you must venerate this person, and it's binding, that seems to really get to the supreme teaching authority of the church.
Well, Not so far, because the church has never said so explicitly, that it's infallible. It's noteworthy that the decree of canonization, given those four: deceases in heaven, persevered in heroic virtue, a model to be imitated, we're obliged to venerate. Given those four, it's noteworthy that the decree of canonization does not speak to the virtue of the individual. It only speaks to their glory, the fact that they're in heaven. So as an example, this is direct wording from the decree of canonization of I forget which saint, but we declare and define blessed so-and-so to be a saint, and we inscribe his name in the canon or the catalog of saints. So that's the decree. Then comes the precept. And we order that he be devoutly honored among the saints throughout the universal church. That's it. So yes, there's always a preamble, and then there are nice things to be said about the saint subsequently. But the decree simply says, we declare to be a saint, inscribe his name in the catalog, and order that he be devoutly honored among the saints throughout the universal church. It does not say that he lived a life of heroic virtue, though the determination that he very probably did so leads to the judgment that he very probably is in heaven.
So in the old days, but before the council, the church was so cautious and had things like the devil's advocate and so forth. And this resulted in a relatively small number of canonizations. And you looked at those people, and I can't find any dissent prior to the council about, Pope St. Pius X wasn't really a saint, or Bellarmine wasn't really a saint, or Thomas Aquinas wasn't really a saint, because it was so obvious, right? And that's getting to this very question that we're tackling today of, if we start to canonize people who were questionable in terms of their heroic virtue, that leads to this question of probability. Is that the point? Why are we now having to say very probably?
Well, even when the process was as it ought to have been before it was changed in 69 and 83, there's a logical syllogism implicit in it. So logical syllogism: major premise, minor premise, conclusion. The first premise, and we know it with absolute certainty, it's de fide. It's the point of all of this. If a person perseveres to the end in heroic virtue, he goes to heaven. That's a de fide teaching of the Catholic faith. I mean, if we don't believe that, what are we all here for? The second premise is a more or less probable fact that we can only know from human testimony, that this individual probably did persevere in heroic virtue. So major premise: persevere in heroic virtue, go to heaven. Minor premise: this person probably persevered in heroic virtue.
I think this is extremely important, and I think we need to be explicit about this, because a lot of Catholics, certainly non-Catholics, don't understand the canonization process. They don't realize that so much of the information that the Holy Father is going to rely upon to make his decisions is based entirely on the testimony of men, every single one of whom is a sinner, some of whom are not even going to be Catholic, some of whom might even be enemies of the faith, right? Doctors who are called upon to give testimony about miracles, or people who lived or worked with the saints, right, or whatever. So in purely human terms, the judgment of canonization can only be said to be as probable as that second premise that you just mentioned.
Right, and which is why divine assistance is necessary. The first premise is certain. The conclusion depends on the second premise, which in purely human terms can only ever be probable.
How certain can we be that divine assistance renders certain what is so clearly uncertain in purely human terms?
Well, we're not certain how certain we can be. So, as noted, the infallibility of canonizations has never been defined as de fide, and is generally agreed to be no more than sententia theologicae certa, theologically certain.
And so many of the people that we've already mentioned, whether it's Cajetan or St. Thomas, they were reaching their conclusions about certainty and probabilities based on a process that's now been abandoned.
Right.
So
and even that process has never been declared to be infallibly certain.
So it would be wrong for people to cite all of those luminaries as if they had commented on the process that we have today, which is so clearly different from before. If the process itself has never been infallibly defined as infallible, it seems clear to me, it's hard to imagine that a single canonization today is of the same theological certainty as an ex cathedra definition such as that of the Assumption.
It never was. And that leaves us with the pertinent question. Dare we question an individual canonization, even according to the old process, the validity of which none of us doubts? To question an individual canonization is considered, is worthy of the censure of error of faith, but it's not heresy. It's still wrong, but it's not heresy. And to reiterate, that assumes that the underlying law is valid. If the underlying law is assumed to be valid, it is not even heresy to ask if the process itself is infallible, because it has never been defined as such.
And if the underlying law is itself doubtful,
yeah, then we move further and further down the hierarchy of theological certainty to levels for which there's no canonical censure at all attached. And then we get to the point where the prudent conclusion is that the process itself is absolutely not infallible, not as defined.
And if we can fairly question the infallibility of the process, then it follows that we can fairly question the infallibility of the product of the process. That would be the individual canonization. I'm looking at the clock. We'll probably have to explore that question maybe more fully in the next episode. Let's conclude, if we can, with a question that should be of interest to all of us who cherish tradition and the traditional liturgy, the traditional Mass. Many people wonder about the saintly Archbishop Lefebvre. He has not been canonized. He has not been beatified. His cause has not even been introduced. I have heard people talk privately about miracles that are associated with him. Can we lawfully venerate him as a saint? All right, Jim, you'll have to restart that part. So pick up after, can we lawfully venerate him as a saint?
So beatification and canonization are about the public worship of the church. To privately venerate a person who is neither beatified nor canonized requires only that we've made the private moral assessment that we have moral certainty of his sainthood. In other words, if you believe, and you should believe, that he is a saint, you are free to venerate him as such. In fact, when this process plays out, one of the things that is looked for is, has a cultus grown up around this person in private veneration? And not only, we should all continuously pray that he would be elevated, that he would be inscribed in the canon of the saints.
Fascinating conversation today, Jim. I appreciate your time. Folks, I hope you have enjoyed this conversation as much as I have. I find it to be very edifying to take these deep dives into the background of our faith, the historicity of it, the canonical basis, the theological questions that help us to understand better, so that we can know our God better. We can't bring ourselves into union with him if we don't know him. We can't love him if we don't know him. And all that the church produces and gives us is designed to be an
It's
aid.
oriented around knowing, loving, and serving him.
Right. So if we don't understand that process and what it obliges us to and why it's there, then we've limited ourselves in terms of our ability to know, love, and to serve him. And of course, in previous eras, people didn't have access to these things, and so therefore, according to their state in life, they wouldn't have the same obligations. But you and I do, by virtue of the fact that you're watching this video, you're listening today, you're demonstrating your desire and your zeal, and our Lord, of course, is providing that. Hopefully, Jim and I are adequate instruments of His will. Jim, thank you again for being here this afternoon.
My pleasure, Jeff.
Next week, are you up for it? Tackling the kind of the follow-on question to this that everybody's going to be asking is, based on everything we've said today, if we accept it at face value, how do we approach the saint factory that some have described, the hundreds, maybe 1,000 or more saints of the last?
It might take more than one more episode. I mean, we have to look at this question of collegiality. We have to look at the question of heroic virtue and how it has been essentially redefined in practice. Then the notion of the saint factory, the sheer insane volume. I mean, I don't know the exact numbers, but I know that John Paul II canonized more saints than the entire church did before him. And then there's a question of individual canonizations where the process was followed sort of, but some of the checks and balances didn't yield the information that we now know that casts serious doubt on certain individual canonizations. So we have a lot to cover.
There is no more devil's advocate, is there?
That's correct. And he's not called that, and he doesn't serve the same function. His primary purpose, we had two purposes. First, to dig up dirt. I mean, to find things that would exclude this person from canonization. The second thing he was there for was to make sure that the process was followed scrupulously. And as I just pointed out, there is very compelling evidence that in the canonizations of several recently canonized saints, the process was not followed. Evidence that was proposed turns out not to have been verified, and it turns out to have, in fact, been falsified. That's scary, Jeff.
So if there's no more devil's advocate, is there really no more devil?
Well, that sort of goes along with the whole theology of the look. New Code of Canon Law, the new liturgy, the Mass and the office and the canonization process are all part and parcel of the same system that we do well to reject. So,
well, I better stop you there, or you're going to have a mob at your place this weekend. I don't think Mrs. DePiante would appreciate that. All right, my friend, be safe. Have a good weekend. Thank you, as always. And friends, we will see you on the next episode to tackle the logical consequences of this issue of canonizations that we've been talking about today. God bless you.
God bless you all. Thank you kindly, Jeff.